The next part of this kind of session is about the relationship between cognition and consciousness, okay? And how cognitive processes are being perceived as conscious processes, or they are labeled as unconscious processes or partially unconscious processes. When we talk about cognition, most of the people believe that just a tip of an iceberg of the entire content of the cognitive processing is in the light of consciousness. So we are just aware of few of the major cognitive processes that are happening inside the brain. And many other cognitive functions are basically under the water. So we might have kind of a general idea about what is happening, but not to the details. And sometimes we might not be aware of anything that is happening on those cognitive processes. And that is an interesting question in terms of what are the cognitive processes that are conscious and what are the other cognitive functions that are not in the light of consciousness. And based on the framework that we discussed before, as you can see here, when we talk about attention and voluntary attention, when we talk about voluntary cognitive processes, we are probably talking about something that is conscious. So being something that is voluntary is probably something that is related to the consciousness. And also when we talk about things that are declarative, things that we can talk about them, so things that are in the control of our language, then these functions are going to be also conscious. So when we talk about consciousness, probably we are talking about two kind of main processes that are defining consciousness. One is language, and the other is the level of control that we have on them. So it seems that the language and control are two major wings of what we call consciousness. And when we talk about consciousness, we can kind of have mainly two dimensions for the consciousness. One is about the content of consciousness. The content was what we have been discussing about. What are the cognitive functions that are involved in the process, that are conscious in the brain? But the other dimension that we can be talking about would be what we call level of consciousness. So we can be talking about, let's say, let me see if I have the pen here. Okay, so we can be talking about what we call awareness. That is about the content of the consciousness. Or we might be talking about wakefulness. That is about the level of the consciousness. Okay? In this kind of two-dimensional space, we can have a spectrum from coma, anesthesia, deep sleep, light sleep, drowsiness, consciousness, wakefulness. So probably, hopefully, most of you are here. I mean, at least those who have been kind of receiving something like a score of 10 of 10, they're probably here in the full consciousness, wakefulness. Maybe if you are here, hopefully none of you are, here or the other parts, okay? So, and you can see here, these two parts, in terms of the content and the level of consciousness, would be highly correlated to each other. So it's something like a correlation of 1, so they are highly correlated to each other. But there are some cognitive processes, or there are some states, I should say, there are some states that are a little bit different with others. So when we talk about the REM sleep, the REM sleep probably has more content than we usually kind of consider from sleep. So we have more content in the REM sleep, but probably the level of consciousness would be almost the same as what we have in deep sleep. So you can see some differences in terms of the content and level of consciousness. But there are some states that we basically have the wakefulness, but there is no content inside. So when we talk about sleepwalking, when we talk about some sorts of seizure. And when we talk about what we call vegetative state, those who are in vegetative state, these are basically people who are wakeful, so they are not asleep, but there is no content in their cognitive processes. Okay? So that is another kind of way of trying to kind of make different dimensions for consciousness, thinking about the level of consciousness and content of consciousness. And to be honest, for us as a cognitive neuroscientist, probably the content is the most important part. And we really like to know how we can increase the awareness regarding the cognitive functions. And even when we are in a, let's say, conscious, wakeful state, the question is there any chance that we can increase the level of awareness that we have for cognitive function? And we call that a specific awareness cognition over cognition. How can we bring up more eyes from the underwater to the surface of the water, to be able to see them, to be able to talk about them, to be able to control them? And that is what we call metacognition. So metacognition or cognitive awareness is about having even a higher level of content in the cognition compared to normal people, that they have a level of understanding about what is happening inside their brain or inside their kind of cognitive processes. How can we have even a higher level, a super level of content in our consciousness about what is happening inside the brain? And I think that what we are doing in a cognitive neuroscience course is not only about a sort of interesting scientific field, it's also about us to be able to bring more content about what is happening inside our brain to the level of consciousness. And I hope that when you learn more about what is happening inside the brain, you would have kind of higher level of cognitive content or cognitive kind of awareness or consciousness content about the brain process. So that is another kind of sort of outcome from this course. If you are interested to learn about more kind of details about what we have been discussing, this is the paper that is published in a journal that I really like. This is called Trends in Cognitive Science. So this is a really highly recommended journal to kind of follow and read. We call that TICS, Trends in Cognitive Science. This is one of the lovely journals that I really love. From the first, I think they started from 1997. Their first kind of issue is published in 1997. And I've been following that from 98. So for now, it's more than 20, something like 2 years that I'm following this journal. It's a really, really good journal, provides lots of really good kind of reviews about what is happening in the field. The reason that we are discussing about consciousness as a really important cognitive function, one of the reasons is one of the kind of the main authors of the main textbook that we are referring to in this class is Dr. Bernard Baars. And Bernard Baars is one of the most famous figures in the field of kind of theories of consciousness. And he has a really nice book on consciousness. He kindly sent me a free copy kind of a few weeks ago, and thank you very much, Dr. Baars, for the copy. I've not started to read it yet, but I'm going to kind of read the book. So I think that's the reason that in this kind of textbook and the kind of the course that we are going to talk about, this textbook, we will talk about consciousness in different occasions. I think that's a good kind of opportunity. There are some challenges when we talk about consciousness in terms of how we can experimentally test consciousness and what are the kind of implications of understanding more about consciousness. So we will discuss about those issues in the next steps. To give you a better idea about some other definition of consciousness, that is the model that Dr. Baars is interested to kind of introduce. And I think it's a kind of good model in terms of when we talk about consciousness, the key player of consciousness is attention. And how he's trying to describe attention is talking about a huge theater hall, that there is a spotlight on the theater light, on the theater scene, inside the theater hall, that is pointing one specific area in the scene of that theater hall, okay? And this is that only spotlight of that entire huge scene that we can see and we can receive information from. And that beam of light is attention. And then attention would bring information from that really kind of limited space that is under attention to the consciousness. So when we talk about consciousness, the model that Dr. Bars is providing about consciousness is that we have a conscious spotlight. This is the scene of the theater. This is the backstage. So when you go to the theaters, there are some backstage. So this is the kind of, you usually do not see the backstage, but this is the backstage of the theater. This is the entire hall of theater. So people are basically sitting around here in the theater hall. So that is the place that the audience would be sitting. So that is the place for sitting the audience. And this is the theater scene. And in the theater scene, that spotlight, that is basically the attention spotlight. This spotlight is where we are aware of what is happening. And out of this spotlight, whatever that is happening here, or whatever that is happening here, is out of our conscious process. And when we kind of make this analogy, the important part is that kind of spotlight has a limited range. So we are able to just have few specific processes within our consciousness. And the spotlight is able to go to the processes that are in the scene. And there are probably things that are out of the scene, and that is the idea that Dr. Bars has. It would be hard to get access to those kind of parts that are out of this specific scene. So that is the kind of one of the models that people try to kind of make a connection between consciousness and cognition, and how these two kind of parts are interacting to each other. I have a few other ideas about kind of the conscious processes. I will discuss about those items when we go through the course in the next weeks. But when we talk about consciousness, it is not just about the cognitive processes. There are specific areas in the brain that are playing a significant role in consciousness. So we know that there are specific brain damages that could disturb several cognitive functions without changing anything in the level of consciousness that you have. I'm talking about the level of consciousness. But when we have some kind of specific areas in the brain affected by brain injuries, those parts of the brain would be playing a significant role in what we call consciousness. So when we want to talk about consciousness, we also need to think about, okay, what are the brain areas that involve in consciousness? And that is going to be challenging. So that is going to be something that we are going to discuss about. One of the kind of important areas in the brain that we are going to talk about in this course is thalamus. And thalamus is a really important part of the brain that would have significant role in consciousness. And one of the reasons that thalamus is involved in the consciousness processing is that the thalamus is the major gateway for sensory information. Most of the sensory inputs to the brain would go from thalamus, and then from thalamus to the entire cortex. So as you can see here in this figure, you can see here that this is a thalamus that is connected almost to everywhere around the cortex. So the thalamus would be highly connected to most of the areas in the cortex. And almost all sensory processes would go from thalamus to the cortex. And when we have a challenge in thalamus, then these kind of this gateway of information to the cortex would be affected, and then the level of consciousness would be significantly affected. So that is another thing that we'll discuss in the next kind of steps when we talk about cognitive functions and how they are related to different parts of the brain and how these two parts are interacting with each other. Meanwhile, it would be nice to know that this kind of technique, it's called white matter tractography, or what we call DTI, and I will tell you what are the details about DTI and how DTI is working. But that is kind of basically the white matter tracks that would start from thalamus and would go over the cortex.